February 1942. 14 days that shook the world. Are you ready to uncover the secrets of these defining moments? As the world was engulfed in the flames of war, each day brought new challenges and decisions that would shape our history. Join us on a journey back to February 1942, a fortnight of war that would dictate the fate of nations. The Eastern Front was a terrible place for any soldier or citizen. Brutal fighting saw the deaths of millions, most of them Soviet troops and citizens. But the frozen landscape had choked the rampaging Nazi Wehrmacht, causing it to stumble and stop dead in its tracks. The Russians, more prepared for the winter, regrouped and launched a counteroffensive. By the time February 1942 came around, this counteroffensive was well underway. It was largely a time of slowly grinding onward. The Germans, suffering casualties thanks to the severe cold and onslaught of Soviet individuals dying for their country, had pulled back to consolidate a more stable defensive line contrary to Hitler's orders. Despite moderate Soviet advances, individuals on both sides were more concerned with keeping warm than anything else. The sheer might of the winter meant quick advances were impossible, as the supply chain would soon be stretched far too thin. As a result, instead of punching holes in each other's lines, the Germans and Russians would try to outflank each other and cut off the newly isolated groups of enemy soldiers. For example, on February 8th, Soviet forces began encircling German troops stationed at Demyansk, not far south of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. The German Second Army Corps, led by the head of the 16th Army, General Oberst Ernst Busch, along with parts of the 10th Army Corps, would soon find themselves trapped in what would become known as the Demyansk Pocket. Around 90,000 men would have to survive without railway communications or support. Although the Soviet leadership was desperate for its forces to continue pushing, cutting off the majority of the German 16th Army. However, the challenging terrain and the ever-present diabolical weather stopped all intended advances. The Second Army Corps and the entire 16th Army were ordered by Hitler to hold their position. Incredibly, they did, and were resupplied by air sorties in a tactic that came to be known as an air bridge. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, wasn't very active in this region, allowing the Luftwaffe to keep the trapped Germans supplied and ready. They would be stuck for another 2 months but would eventually break out after suffering heavy casualties. In another fascinating development, Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu met with Hitler on February 10th. Antonescu was an evil man responsible for facilitating the Holocaust in Romania, a man not unlike Adolf Hitler himself. Antonescu and Hitler held meetings for 2 days at Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. He promised to commit large numbers of troops to the war against the Soviets in exchange for modern equipment and being allowed to keep Transylvania. How would the Eastern Front develop? 2 mighty armies pushed to and fro in the struggle for conquest. In the Pacific, the war continued just as it had for the last 6 weeks. Japanese invasions continued and continued successfully. Japan's forces took Ambon Island, defeating the Dutch and Australian combatants defending it on February 3rd. The Battle of Makassar Strait, a naval battle against an ABDA fleet, that is, American, British, Dutch, Australian, again saw Japanese victory on February 4th. On February 9th, 10th, 12th, and 14th. The Japanese claimed victory in the Battle of Sarimbun Beach, the Battle of Kranji, the Battle of Bukit Timah, and the Battle of Pasir Panjang, respectively. As a result, Singapore, Britain's last major military base in the Pacific, utterly fell to the Japanese on February 15th. The fighting had taken just 1 week, with Japan optimizing air-supported ground and naval attacks and taking advantage of the colonies isolated so far from their major allies. On February 14th, the invasion of Sumatra, another Dutch colony, commenced. The war for Sumatra lasted much longer, but it too would eventually fall before the end of March. The Japanese conquest continued relentlessly, and not one of the US, the UK, Australia, the Netherlands, or the Chinese were poised to stop them. But then, that was all part of the Europe First plan. Eventually, the tables would begin to turn. American strategy was, per the agreement with Britain and her other allies, to contain the Japanese threat in the Pacific while actively dealing with the German and Italian forces in Europe. The containment strategy kicked off with a series of quick attacks on Japanese-held positions, the first of which came on February 1, 1942. It involved air raids and naval bombardments targeting Japanese positions on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Unsurprisingly, it became known as the Marshall-Gilbert's raids. The Marshall-Gilbert raids were technically a success, but provided no real strategic benefit. However, a positive strike back at the enemy was a massive boost to the morale of American civilians. Across the world, on the shores of the beautiful Mediterranean, a very different war was being fought. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, masterfully arranged his troops, tanks, and supply line, thrusting with devastating efficiency whenever the opportunity presented itself. Now, he and the forces under his command were pushing the British Eighth Army back through Libya and towards Egypt and Alexandria, where British HQ was based. Neil Ritchie, the general in charge of the British Army in North Africa, ordered the front line to move back around the coast to Gazala on February 1, 1942, to avoid being encircled and trapped by Rommel's rapid advance. All the progress the British and Commonwealth troops had made since November was falling, and rapidly. On February 3rd, he retook Timimi. The next day, February 4th, they entered Derna, and by February 7th, Axis troops halted opposite the Gazala Line fortifications. It had taken less than 2 weeks for Rommel to recapture almost all the territory the Brits had seized during the 6-week offensive in November and December 1941. Now, with the foes squaring off near Gazala, each would try to find a way through or around the tightly packed army groups and coastal roads. Chelmno concentration camp had begun its systematic genocide of the Jewish population. Prisoners were forced into gas vans and murdered. The killings and pogroms had been going on for years by now, but concentration camps and static gas chambers were starting to become the Nazis' favored method of murder. The Wannsee Conference had been held, and Nazi officials had formally instigated the final solution in a chilling meeting that lasted less than 90 minutes. It was now governmental policy for Nazis to find, capture, and kill Jews for no reason other than that they were Jewish by race. The Holocaust is the worst example of human genocide in history. In the first week of February 1942, a chill ran down the spines of anyone with an ounce of compassion. Jewish people among the populations of occupied Europe or countries allied with Germany were in even more immediate danger than before. Later in the month, the killings would become much larger in scale, especially at Chelmno. Another concentration camp would also start to receive significant numbers of Jewish fathers, mothers, children, brothers, and sisters. Its name was Auschwitz. Against the backdrop of human atrocities and the terrible realities of merciless conflict, civilians had to attempt to continue leading life under the new normal. Rationing was commonplace throughout British stores. It would soon become necessary even in North America, far away from almost all the fighting. For example, on February 3rd, the British government implemented a maximum retail price for clothing. Recognizing the vital fundamental need for supplies, the British created a new governmental position, the Minister of War Production. On February 4th, Max Aitken, known as Lord Beaverbrook, assumed this office. He would resign soon after, On February 19th, when the role was renamed Minister of Production and given to Oliver Littleton, MP, until the end of the war. Commercial production lines, factories, and warehouses were often repurposed for the war effort. Millions of civilian workers worldwide began building weapons and tanks instead of their previous assignments. Most notably, the Rouge Ford factory in Dearborn, Michigan, switched to producing military vehicles instead of civilian cars. The last civilian car rolled off the production line on February 10, 1942. Most alarmingly for America, U-boat attacks of significance crept far closer to their eastern shore. Tanker WL Steed was sunk by U-boat U-103 on February 2, 90 miles east of the Delaware River. 2 days later, U-103, the same U-boat, also sank the oil tanker India Arrow. The next day, February 5th, it sank another American tanker, this time the Chennai Arrow. Similar carnages followed around the country, especially near Atlantic City. It was no wonder then that Roosevelt decided to do something, and quickly. Partly in response to what the German U-boat captains called the American shooting season, the U.S. introduced the Warshipping Administration, or WSA. Like the British Ministry of War Transport, it was a government agency established by Roosevelt on February 7th. Its responsibilities were to ensure an adequate supply of ships for civilian and armed forces use. The WSA worked with the Ministry of War Transport through the Combined Shipping Adjustment Board to optimize the tonnage of supplies making their way across the seas. Early February saw the worldwide war stutter in the Northern Hemisphere's winter. The fighting became more desperate, with the Allies watching Japan's rapid advances and victories with mounting concern. But there was nothing else for it. They would have to wait it out, build their strength, and return with a vengeance. Stalin grimaced over the losses on the Eastern Front. Hitler was enraged at his all-powerful army stalling and failing after such promising years. Churchill was happy overall, knowing that America's involvement all but guaranteed victory in the end. Roosevelt was cautious, monitoring the Pacific Front with unease as he desperately tried to reinforce Britain and stay aware of internal politics. Everything was coming to a head. As February's battles pave the way for spring, the war enters a new phase. What will happen next? Stay tuned to find out. For more deep dives into the pivotal moments of the Second World War, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. Don't miss out on our journey through history. Ring the bell for the latest updates. Every day in war writes a new page of history. Join us as we continue to explore these critical moments that shaped our world.